Although I am not the raging Joss Whedon fanboy that many other geeks seem to be, I did enjoy most of his run on Astonishing X-Men, starting in 2004 and ending in 2008. Not to go for the obvious pun, but I was no less than astonished by his first issue and even the entire first arc of his run. While I certainly had problems with the other three arcs composing his run, Whedon's work on the title resulted in me setting a very high expectation for whoever followed him on the book. It ended up being Warren Ellis who followed Whedon. Just like the overabundance of Whedon love, I feel very much the same about Warren Ellis. While he has produced some extraordinary work, like Planetary, and I very much enjoyed his Ultimate Fantastic Four run, I do not consider myself a fan of Warren Ellis. I was thoroughly disappointed by his 12-issue Next Wave Agents of Hate series, and that was even more true for his run on The Authority, after I had heard so much praise heaped on that series. All of these factors led me to be very lukewarm in going into Warren Ellis's opening arc on Astonishing X-Men. My ambivalence of his run, as well as my feelings that the opening just did not pack the same punch as Whedon's story that introduced a cure for mutant kind, eventually led to me dropping the Astonishing X-Men title after the conclusion of the Ghost Box arc. I had all of the singles from this arc, but I had not read the story until recently in trade paperback form. I am now happy to say that this arc holds up better than I remembered it being. Part of that, no doubt, comes from me attempting to judge this based on its own merits and not based on how well it holds up to a story arc from another writer 4 years earlier. There are some really fantastic creative ideas that we see explored in this story, and my only gripe concerning them is that we do not get to see more of them explored. Something like Mutant Sans Frontiers seems interesting enough that it could prove to be just what is needed to separate what might appear to be a typical superhero comic from another typical superhero comic. I am not saying that we need to see all the boring minutiae of the organization that provides the X-Men with the new aircraft, but seeing something that exists in this world that does not exist in our own could be very interesting to see more of, which we sadly do not. Some other things that I wish I could see more of in the Marvel Universe at large is the spaceship graveyard, something that makes a great deal of sense when you consider how often alien invasions happen in the Marvel Universe, and how it must be even more often that we don't even see alien invasions happen in the books that we read. It only makes sense that there would be a piece of land allocated for discarded ships. And while this is not on the same level of these other items, I was intrigued by the idea that the X-Men are consultants for unusual cases for the San Francisco Police Department, much like Batman for the Gotham City Police. This dynamic was never seen when the X-Men lived in New York, and in fact there was at least one issue from the early days of Chris Claremont's run on Uncanny X-Men where a police officer showed disdain for the X-Men for always being near the trouble he encounters. Showing that the police are willing to seek consultation from the X-Men on bizarre cases is an excellent way to bring the X-Men into stories easier, and it's a shame that this dynamic was not used to its fullest before Marvel anxiously jumped at the chance to shake up the status quo once again during the Utopia crossover with Dark Avengers. Warren Ellis has a very firm grasp on the voices of each of the characters, which is something I failed to notice when I read this series the first time through. Every character, even characters like Forge and Abigail Brand, who only seem to have cameos in the story, have very funny moments and very funny lines that still feel true to who they are and how they sound like, and not simply a gag transforming a blank character into a vessel for a joke, as one might expect in a lesser comic book. The story that we get is an interesting yet simple one. After 4 years of Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men, which very much felt like it was set away from the rest of the Marvel Universe and only begrudgingly acknowledged when big changes in the status quo took place, it is refreshing to see Warren Ellis' opening arc make nods to House of M, the Manifest Destiny soft relaunch for the X-Men books, and the somewhat recent backup stories Endangered Species. Not only does Ellis make references to these stories, but he does so in a way that it is unnecessary to read them before reading this book. I enjoy this, as I am not a fan of buying a book and then finding out, either before reading or in the course of reading, that I first have to read some other book that comes before. It's quite refreshing to read a book that exists on its own, but does not shirk away from being part of the universe that it is a part of. Ellis even takes this further, as the events of this story really spring from the events of House of M and Endangered Species, two stories that I did not enjoy at all. What we see here, annexation from alternate universes, synthetic mutants, and wacky technology that seems plausible and ridiculous at the same time, Many of these ideas are mostly new and fresh in the world of the X-Men and are being applied to a story that organically comes from the events of past stories. This surprises me, as Ellis has often struck me as almost embarrassed by a long-running history or continuity for a franchise like the X-Men, to the point where I would have expected him to have little regard for stories that are not his own. Simone Bianchi's artwork is very dark and at times hard to make out. His style is not one that I care for very much, especially coming off of the very photorealistic style of John Cassaday from the previous run on this book. But he depicts things like the ghost box technology and the grotesque synthetic mutants with a style that makes sense for the kind of horror that is conveyed within the story. I cannot think of anybody who I would not recommend this story to. It is highly accessible for someone who has not read X-Men and is maybe curious about what the series is about and where they should begin, even though it has very little to do with the current status quo after the events of Avengers vs. X-Men. The story is handled deftly, and while the art is not something I care for, it is also handled in a way that serves the story for the better. I highly recommend buying and reading Astonishing X-Men Ghost Box for X-fanatics, casual fans, and people curious about a high-profile name like Warren Ellis on Astonishing X-Men.